All right. Good morning, everyone. I am Nekima Levy Armstrong. I'm a civil rights attorney, activist, founder of the Racial Justice Network, and executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation. So many of you all know me as a frontline warrior for justice, continuing to just be out there speaking the truth and letting the chips fall where they may. And it was out of that spirit of speaking the truth and trying to break down barriers that I worked with Citizen Ed to launch this new podcast called Rise Up. Rise Up is not only the name of my podcast, but it's also the name of our digital platform for the organization in which I'm the executive director, called the Wayfinder Foundation. So you can find Rise Up on WordPress, and it's a platform for Black and brown women to speak the truth and let the chips fall where they may. So I am honored today to have this discussion with one of my former colleagues, an esteemed law professor, Mark Osler. I'm going to, encourage Mark to say hi to everyone. And then, Mark, if it's okay with you, I want to share some information about your background with the audience, and then feel free to share whatever you would like to share about your background. But I want them to know about the breadth and scope of the work that you have been doing as someone who uses your legal acumen and skill and academic knowledge and background to stand up for justice and to challenge some of the inequities within the criminal justice system. So Mark, if you could take a moment to say hi, then I'll go from there in terms of introducing you to the audience.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me on to talk about something so important. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And when I first saw you, I joked around that you look like a professor today. You got the books behind you in your office at St. Thomas Law School. You have your glasses on. Yep. So you look great, ready for action.
I am.
So for the listening audience, thank you guys for tuning in. You definitely play a huge role in being a part of this conversation. You can write in the comments and share anything that you want to share. Let other people know about this podcast, but most importantly, let them know about the case of Myon Burrell. Myon Burrell is going before the pardon board in the state of Minnesota next week on December 15th. And so this conversation is very timely, it's compelling. And as a community, you all played a role in getting Myon Burrell to this point of having his case being taken seriously by the powers that be. So I want to talk to Mark Osler today because he chaired the legal panel that spent an extensive amount of time looking into Myon's case. And earlier this week, they released a report that includes some of the findings that they made, along with some fascinating elements of the case and their recommendation that Myon Burrell be released from prison. The person who chaired that esteemed legal panel, which included attorneys and scholars from around the country, is Mark Osler. So I'm going to share a little bit about his background with you all. Professor Mark Osler's work advocates for sentencing and clemency policies rooted in principles of human dignity. In 2016 and 2019, the graduating class at UST Law chose him as Professor of the Year. In 2015, he won the Dean's Award for Outstanding Scholarship. And in 2013, he received the Outstanding Teaching Award. Osler's writing on clemency, sentencing, and narcotics policy has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and in law journals at Harvard, Stanford, the University of Chicago, Northwestern, Georgetown, Ohio State, and UNC. His University of Chicago Law Review article, which he wrote with Rachel Barkow, was highlighted in a lead editorial in the New York Times, in which the New York Times editorial board expressly embraced Barkow and Osler's argument for clemency reform. He's also the sole author of a new casebook, Contemporary Criminal Law. Mark, as many of you may not be aware, is actually a former federal prosecutor. He played a role in striking down the mandatory 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine in the federal sentencing guidelines by winning the case of Spears v. United States at the U.S. Supreme Court, with the court ruling that judges could categorically reject that ratio. And thank the Lord for that, because we know that so many African-American people wound up in the criminal justice system spending decades at times behind bars because of that 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine. Mark has testified as an expert before the U.S. Sentencing Commission and the U.S. House Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Just over 10 years ago, he wrote a book called Jesus on Death Row, which is very powerful. We heard a lot about Mark's book and some of the stories that he featured when I was a law professor at St. Thomas. So as you can see, Mark has been really getting it in terms of using his legal skills, his writing skills, and his advocacy skills to stand up for justice and for those who do not typically have a voice in this system. So once again, welcome, Mark Osler.
Well, thanks, Nekima. And I do want to say something about working the crack powder ratio, which is that we were in that fight together. And I remember reading what you wrote, and that was part of the motivation for going forward and trying to make that difference.
That's amazing, Mark. Thank you for sharing that. So as I mentioned earlier, for our listening audience, I used to teach at St. Thomas Law. I was there from 2003 until 2016. And I ran a civil rights legal clinic during my time there, but I also wrote legal scholarship focused on the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And I looked specifically at the issues that Black and brown women and mothers were facing when they were brought into the criminal justice system, as well as the impacts on their children. So my work and Mark's work intersected. And one of the things that was really interesting to me when you interviewed to become a law professor at St. Thomas was finding out about your role in the story, the movie American Violet. You remember that, Mark?
Yeah, it was weird having someone play you in a movie. But, you know, that was just one small bit of a big project that so many people had a lot invested in and made a difference in the end, I hope.
So for that particular story, I would recommend folks check out American Violet if you haven't seen it already. It's essentially about a Black mother. She's a single mom who is brought into the criminal justice system on trumped up charges. It's based on a true story where law enforcement was raiding the projects where she lived, I believe in Texas. Mm-hmm. And she literally had to take on the system and take on a corrupt prosecutor who was very comfortable prosecuting poor Black folks and, you know, putting their names on lists, charging them as part of drug conspiracy cases with very scant evidence. And most of those people did not have adequate legal representation. And so Mark was one of the folks who enlisted one of his former law students to take on that case and to get involved in that fight. And ultimately, the young woman in that case triumphed in terms of being able to disentangle herself from that system. And sadly, her story is not uncommon, you know, in many communities across the country where we see overzealous prosecutors, we see police, and oftentimes a lack of accountability. And those things can lead to injustices within these systems. So, Mark, what year did you move to the state of Minnesota?
2010. And so between 2000 and 2010, I was working at Baylor down in Waco, Texas. That's what brought me into contact with the story in Hearn, Texas.
Excellent. So when you got here in 2010, what were your thoughts about the Twin Cities of Minnesota, about our justice system, and about, you know, this environment as far as being progressive?
Yeah, you know, I moved here from a very conservative place. I expected to be moving into a much more progressive place. In some ways that was true. But one thing that I learned quickly from you and from my students of color was the disparities that we had here, stemming from housing, stemming from employment, that even though Minnesota had this reputation, that really wasn't the reality on the ground when it came to racial issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very shocking when you move here, because I moved here in 2003, and I was told about how progressive Minnesota was, the Twin Cities. It would be a great place to raise my family. But literally, once I got out and started meeting with members of the Black community, I saw the truth in terms of the high level of racial disparity in our criminal justice system, as well as economically. So let's fast forward a little bit and talk about the recent case that has been on the minds of a lot of Minnesotans and people around the nation, and that's the case of Myon Burrell. So for those who are watching, most of you all know that we stood alongside Myon's family in trying to lift up his case, let people know about what was happening, and advocating for him to be set free. If we hadn't done the disruption that occurred, unfortunately, Myon's case might have fallen on deaf ears, but his family's been relentless. Myon has been relentless. And now the community is stepping up to demand freedom for Myon. Well, one of the important developments in that process of advocating was Myon's family being able to get the attention of prominent legal scholars and attorneys who work within these systems. And so, Mark, I want you to talk a little bit about how you came to be connected to the group that formed the legal panel. And then what was your role as chair of that panel? How long were you all convened as a panel of legal scholars and advocates? And then talk about the report that you released this week. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I got involved after, as you mentioned, activists raised the profile of this case. It was something that got attention that probably it should have gotten a long time ago at that level. There were two national figures in the wrongful conviction movement. One is Laura Nyrider at Northwestern, and the other is Barry Scheck, who's the co-founder of the Innocence Project out of New York. And they reached out to me and said, we're forming an independent panel, not affiliated with the Innocence Project or anything else, but one or any of the parties, but an independent panel to look at this case. And we want you to chair that. I asked who else was going to be involved, and I talked about the people. It included David Singleton from Ohio, who does incredible work, who I'm familiar with, and some of the other folks. And I knew it was going to be a lot of work, but I also knew how important it was. One of the things that this panel took on that's pretty rare is both the integrity of the conviction and the integrity of the sentence at the same time. And coming from the sentencing side, not the conviction integrity side, that was important to me. We started in early summer, really got going in July, and it was intense. That every week we were interviewing people, we were evaluating the evidence, we reviewed everything that was available in the case and some stuff that previously was not available. And the story that emerged was really striking and complicated and tragic at a lot of levels. Nekima, you've heard me say this before, but criminal law is all about tragedy, every bit of it. And we can't unkill somebody, but in criminal law, the best we can do is not magnify the tragedy. And the closer we looked at this, it appeared that that's what happened, is that there was the tragedy of the death of 11-year-old Taisha Edwards. There's the tragedy of the life and eventual death of Timothy Oliver. But then there was the tragedy that revolved around Myon Burrell as well. And, I'm sure we'll talk more about what's in the report. But we talked with all sides. And we talked with the prosecutors. We talked with the witnesses. We talked with former Mayor R.T. Ryback, who described for us the political context, really the press intensity over cases like this at that time. And 59 pages may seem like a long report, but there's a lot in there, and there's an important story to tell.
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about some of the particulars of the report and some of the things that were fascinating that came out of the report? And as you're thinking about that, I want to share a quote that came from Myon Burrell. Apparently WCCO, which is the local CBS affiliate, either interviewed Myon Burrell or got information through the Associated Press report. But there is a story that they have on their website. And here's a quote that they have by Myon Burrell. He says, I'm extremely joyful that this independent review team went into this investigation with fresh, unbiased eyes, seeking only to find the truth about what actually happened in my case. So he apparently wrote an email to the Associated Press from the state prison in Stillwater. What are your thoughts when you hear that kind of comment coming from Myon Burrell?
I think that's it's good to hear, and it's completely accurate too, that we did come at this with fresh eyes. There was no one involved who had a history with this case. Most of the people weren't even familiar with it when we started, and that was a real advantage. The other thing was, it's not always a good thing, but we had a $0 budget. We all were doing this pro bono from start to finish, and while that makes it hard, especially in a time of budget cuts like we've had everywhere, it also means that you are completely independent. There's no one who's funding your work who's going to try to sway it. Now, just to talk about what we saw when we dug into the case, there's two sides to it, and I want to talk about the sentencing side first. Even setting aside the question of guilt or innocence, and that's an important question, believe me, we spent most of the report on that. But even setting that aside, when you look at who Myon Burrell is, that he is somebody who we should welcome into society, that over the 18 years that he's been incarcerated, while protesting his innocence, he has grown and matured from the 16-year-old he was at the time he went on. He's become a religious leader within the prison. He's somebody who's, despite all the restrictions that go with incarceration, has been a strong member of his family and has developed his family. Someone who has worked on projects that like restorative justice within the prison. And, because I do clemency work, I've seen hundreds of prison records, hundreds. And there's good ones and bad ones, and then there's excellent ones. And Myon Burrell is at the far end of the excellent ones. And that is something that regardless of what people think about innocence or guilt, that is a truth. And even if we look at what the government said, which is, he was, two guys drove him to this site and then he fired at a guy across the street, across Chicago Avenue. Even if we accept that as true, then this is a 16-year-old who is being led to do something by two adults. And that wasn't taken into consideration at all in the sentencing. This time of pandemic, if nothing else, it should have chastened all of us to understand that people change and struggle. And certainly that goes for those who are in prison as well. And so even setting aside that, one of our conclusions was that when you look at the purposes of sentencing, that they do not fit this person, that it does not support his incarceration. And in a nation of freedom, we always have to choose in favor of freedom in a situation like that. But looking at the conviction as well, there was such a fascinating group of people, real experts, looking at the conviction side. And part of what they were able to see was the inconsistencies in some of the evidence, and also evidence that undermined the proofs of the government. And one thing I want to start out with, which is really interesting, is that he was tried twice. In the first time, the conviction was reversed because of misconduct by the government in the way that he was denied access to his mother during the time that he was interviewed, among other things. And then he was tried again. And the second time, so there was an eyewitness the first time that he was tried who testified, and that was the person who was being shot at, Timothy Oliver. And between the first trial in 2003 and the second trial in 2008, Timothy Oliver died. And so, of course, that's going to weaken the government's case. And they tried to bolster this by using jailhouse informants, and that is people within prison or jails who are often positioned so that they can engage in a conversation with someone and then will testify that the person made incriminating statements. Now, those kinds of witnesses are really problematic because you've got such a strong incentive to lie because they're doing it so they can get out of prison. I was trained as a prosecutor at the Department of Justice. And one of the things that we learned even back then, and this was in the 90s, was, stay away from jailhouse informants, that they are inherently not going to be credible with people. And there's a lot of landmines with using them. Well, that idea has really advanced even since that time. One of the things that we got was an expert report from Alexandra Natipov at Harvard University, who's the leading national expert on the use of these kinds of witnesses. And that's part of what really convinced us that there was deep problems with the use of those witnesses. Other things that we looked at that were really troubling, one was that the government stood on the fact, as they put it in the trial, that when he was interviewed, Myon Burrell, not while he was interviewed, but on a phone call to his mom, he said, "I'm not innocent." And that was presented without much context. And once you look at the whole of that call, it's not, "Mom, I'm guilty." It's something that's much more nuanced, which is, I'm not a perfect kid. I've done wrong things. And I don't think anybody contested that at the trial, but it is a big difference. Another thing, too, is that there were prison calls that we were able to look at that weren't presented at trial, where, for example, Ike Tyson, who's a man who was convicted by plea of having been involved in this murder. And since then has said, "I was the shooter, not Myon Burrell. Myon Burrell wasn't there." Well, people can say, well, he changed his mind later. But while he was initially locked up, he had a call to a woman outside of the prison. And part of what he says is, "Why do they think Myon was there?" As they called him Skits. "Why do they think little Skits was there? He wasn't there. I thought he was in Bemidji." And to someone like me who's used to evaluating credibility, that's something that's really important and really troubling when we look at someone who's been in prison for 18 years.
Wow. This is fascinating. I also had read about some of the police officers, or at least one, offering money to some of the informants for their testimony. And didn't many of these guys who participated later recant their statements about Myon?
Yeah, there was a lot of that. And, one thing, too, is that when we read about that, and so many things in this case, it's not just about Myon Burrell, although it is immediately about him. It's about larger problems in society, and especially in criminal justice. That idea of paying informants. I mean, I read that and I thought, well, yeah, they did that, but they do that all the time, because that's a very common practice to pay informants for tips and names and things like that. Does it lead to a lot of false accusations? Absolutely. And so that's when I saw that, is it troubling? Yes. Is it unusual? Not at all. And another thing that came out in this, just to look at the societal context of it, is that a lot of the fervor to convict this guy came out of the idea that an 11-year-old girl who's doing her homework was killed. And that does have tremendous sympathy. It really does. But one thing that struck me is that there were two victims of this shooting, because the guy they were shooting at, Timothy Oliver, whoever it was, one bullet went through his pants leg. And so he was almost killed by this, but no one ever describes him as a victim. In fact, about a year after this happened, and the conviction and the sentence and everything came down, Timothy Oliver actually was shot and killed on the street, in Minneapolis. And when he died, pretty much all the reporting, it was only reported because, this is the person that was being shot at when Taisha Edwards was killed. That's how little we valued that life, that other victim, as well. And I found in the broader scope that if we present someone who is deeply sympathetic, as an 11-year-old girl is and should be, then it's easy to get people really worked up. If the victim is a 17-year-old black male who has a history with gangs, then it's almost like that's just, par
for the course.
Par for the course. And really, if you're someone who believes in the human dignity of everyone, that child, who's a 17-year-old, is still a child, is precious too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that didn't seem to come into the equation at all.
Well, I think when you look at the way in which society often views African Americans in general, but especially young African American men, there is a dehumanization attached to their presence, right? That's how we've allowed police to abuse people, particularly young black men, without any real accountability or transparency within that particular system. And that's part of the reason why 40% of those who are incarcerated are African American, and many of whom are claiming that they're innocent or they were set up or they didn't have adequate legal defense. And for many of us, understanding the connection between the system of mass incarceration and the system of slavery in this country, or the institution of slavery, it's easy to see how we can get to the place in which Black lives can be lost or criminalized or abused. And as a society, we are taught to look the other way.
And unless the people in power start to see that and understand that and take that into account, and mostly people who look like me, we're going to be in deep trouble in this country, morally.
Absolutely. Now, earlier you talked about a couple things I want to circle back to. One having to do with your interview with the former mayor, R.T. Ryback, and his description of the political context within which Myon Burrell could have been convicted, with very scant evidence, conflicting evidence and information. What insights did he share that were informative for your committee?
Yeah, I mean, I first want to start out by noting something that I found remarkable, that out of this whole story, one of the few government actors who was really admirable was R.T. Ryback. He heard about this shooting. He goes to the hospital and sits with the family. He's there as they come back and say Taisha's dead. During the funeral, he actually took Taisha's little sister, Lakia, with him. And they went and he took her to his house and watched the Vikings game. And then had that family, because this happened right before Thanksgiving, the family over for Thanksgiving dinner at his house. And that humanity and vulnerability is something, and humility really, is something we didn't see in the other actors here. But in terms of the political context that you talk about, he did talk about how there was this intense focus on shootings, on gang violence, focused on the African American community within Minneapolis, that was, built on itself too, and demanded and seemed to demand to political actors, that something be done. And as so often happens when there's a demand generally that something be done, it's often those with the fewest resources who bear the brunt of what's being done. And that was part of it. But, for someone who wasn't there at the time, wasn't in Minneapolis at the time, it was really worthwhile to hear him talk about the intense press interest in this case and in cases like it.
Absolutely. I mean, from what I understand about that time period, Minneapolis was known as Murderapolis because of the high homicide rate that was happening as a result of gun violence, and the fear that all of that created. It was like its own form of a pandemic that gravely impacted the African American community. You couple that with the economic injustice, as well as some of the pressure from those who didn't live in those communities to crack down on crime, and that leads to situations like what we saw with Myon Burrell. And you all, in your report, talked a lot about the police having tunnel vision as they were investigating the case. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that.
Yeah, one of the members of the panel, Keith Finley, has spent a lot of his academic career looking at this idea of tunnel vision. What that means is when the police start investigating the case and they identify a target, they lock in on that. Instead of continuing to look for evidence of who may have done this crime, they only look for evidence that this person did the crime. That's the way when they hear a phone call where it's a child talking to his mom, they pluck out just the one part that can be construed as a confession instead of looking at the whole of it, who they choose to look at. In this case, from the time that they first brought him in, Myon Burrell was saying one of the things in this case that's kind of striking is that his alibi was, he was saying, at the time of the shooting, I was at Cup Foods and I was with a couple other people, and we actually heard response to the shooting and things like that. But that's where I was. And if you pull the security tapes at Cup Foods, it'll show me there at that time. And it appears that the police never pulled those tapes because that wasn't something that would support their theory at that time, which was that Myon Burrell was the shooter.
Mm-hmm. Now, as the mother of a son who is 15, about to be 16 next week,
mm-hmm.
This case is terrifying, for me to think about, right? Having daughters and also thinking about how a lot of times as Black mothers, we have to worry about our sons. We have to worry about them in terms of, someone in the community potentially harming them and or the police and how they are viewed automatically as a suspect. And it sounds like some of that was present in terms of how Myon Burrell was treated and the fact that he wasn't humanized at all throughout this case. As a matter of fact, as I read through your report, I saw instances of the documentation saying that he was 17, when in reality he was just 16 years old, which meant that he should have been treated more as a child, as opposed to being treated like a grown man throughout the proceedings.
And it wasn't just him either. One of the things in reading the whole of this that upset me the most, and this is a former prosecutor, is that when they went to trial both times, they called Taisha's little sister, Lakia, to testify. I mean, think about it. She was there with Taisha when she died, when she was shot. And think of the trauma. She was 8 years old at that time. And then they call this 8-year-old to testify both times. Now, I teach criminal law. As you mentioned, I wrote a case book about criminal law. Criminal law is all about elements. And what you have to prove with murder is identity, that there's an actual death, and that death was caused by the person who you've identified. Lakia was necessary to show none of it whatsoever. The only reason to call her would have been to generate sympathy, and to generate outrage over the case. And that is so tragic that even setting aside everything with Myon, the dehumanization of an 8-year-old girl to do that just to get some advantage in your case. I mean, it completely undermines the idea that, well, we do this in the name of the victims. And that was part of it that really, really troubled me.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about the dehumanization, I would say, of Black people and Black children, I think this case really highlights and illustrates that. One of the commentators in the comments said that the human brain doesn't fully develop until 26. I think it's 24 or 26. Mm-hmm. Myon was 16 maybe at the time that this happened. He lost his mother, within weeks or months of being incarcerated.
3 weeks.
Go ahead.
It was 3 weeks after he was arrested. She died
in a very tragic car accident, and he wasn't allowed to even go and see his mother.
Right.
And so what you were saying earlier in terms of his remarkable record, in spite of what he has been through and all that he pours out inside the criminal justice system, it's astounding, because any person who's gone through that would probably have a hardened heart, be bitter, and unfortunately feel that they have nothing to lose as a result of having almost 20 years of your life taken away from you.
And Nekima, one thing too is that the commenter who's saying that is in good company, because the United States Supreme Court, in a series of cases going back to Roper, has said the same thing over and over, has recognized the brain science that says that children are not fully formed, that a 16-year-old, even people in their early 20s, don't have fully formed brains. And that means that they're more capable of change than anyone else. And that cuts completely against and discredits that whole theory about super predators who will never change. And so since the time that he was first incarcerated, the nation has changed in the way that we view children. As we, it was a really wrong path to diverge from that in the first place, but we did. And we've been called back, and the Supreme Court has recognized it. And the person who pushed that in the Supreme Court, that line of cases, is Bryan Stevenson, one of our most morally focused advocates on these issues.
Yeah, and Bryan Stevenson, for those who don't know, is a law professor who runs the Equal Justice Initiative, which focuses a lot on capital punishment cases and juvenile sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Mm-hmm. So I think that this case causes us all, if we're willing, to look more deeply within and to ask the question about how things got this far out of hand without people feeling outraged earlier in the process. Why did it take a political connection to this case for people to actually wake up and see the injustices? When I ran the Community Justice Project at St. Thomas Law School, we took on a case of a young man who was caught up in the same cycles of Minneapolis being called Murderapolis, and young Black men coming into the system, and he was charged and convicted for a murder that he did not commit. His name is Karan Whitaker, and he is still in prison to this day. I think he's been there since he was 19 years old. He's now about my age. I'm in my early 40s. He was a young dad when he went into the criminal justice system, just like Myon, who was a new father when all of this happened, which I think most people didn't even realize that he had a child, a newborn baby that he was trying to take care of. And that's why his mom moved him to Bemidji in the first place, to try to uproot him from all the turmoil that was happening in the environment in Minneapolis. But this young man who we represented, we actually did a petition for post-conviction relief and advocated for him. And it honestly, every step of the way, we faced barriers. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about, Myon's case and how thankfully, through the activism, the work of the community, standing with Myon's family, through you all as legal experts making a decision to get involved, he actually has an opportunity to get his life back. He can't get back what he lost, but he does have an opportunity for freedom when he goes before the pardon board, because now the governor knows about this case, the attorney general knows about this case, many in the legal community here and nationally know about this case. But my former client is still locked up, along with many other people who were Black teenagers, young Black men, where there's no real opportunity for them to be released. So let's talk a little bit about this notion of conviction integrity and how this may set the stage for more work around a conviction integrity unit and reform in that area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we're seeing going forward is that the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, got a grant for $300,000 from the Department of Justice to set up a conviction review unit, and for the whole state. And that's really worthwhile. That's a great development, and we'll see how they staff it and everything. So there's a lot to be determined on that. But Nekima, the issues you talk about right now, about how many people there are who have been affected by tunnel vision, by jailhouse informants, by being oversensitive to juvenile, or being innocent and being, not having the maturity to deal with the system in a way that allows you to protest your innocence effectively. we're talking about so many lives. It's tragic. And people will protest and say, well, why are we spending time on this group of people? It's because that's where we've done the most wrong. And that's why. And I think hopefully part of what our panel did was steer people towards seeing that. Now, I'd encourage people too that Myon Burrell's clemency hearing is going to be on the 15th. It's Tuesday of next week, and anyone can watch it. It's live streamed on the Minnesota Department of Corrections Facebook page. If you Google Minnesota Board of Pardons and go to next meeting, there's a link to where that's going to be live streamed. And on the 15th, his case will probably be heard between 3:30 and 5. And because everything's online now, virtually instead of meeting in person, that means everybody can watch from their homes.
Okay. So the hope is that people will tune in December 15th, sometime between 3:30 and 5, by going to the Department of Corrections website. In the meantime, we want people to send prayers and positive energy for Myon Burrell. I mean, this has to be anxiety inducing, to wait this long for your voice to be heard, for your case to be heard. And now your fate rests in the hands of two people who can make the decision of whether you're pardoned or not. So he needs all the good energy that he can get at this moment. But honestly, you all made a huge difference in terms of taking the time, like you said, pro bono, to look at this case inside and out and to review the evidence that was made available to you, and then to make your public declaration about where you stand and what you think needs to happen. We need to see more of this when people have nowhere to turn. When they're professing their innocence, when they're saying I've been over sentenced, they need to have somewhere to turn. And we need more lawyers and legal scholars to take personal responsibility for helping to address these situations.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that is just one part of what happened here and what has to happen. The first part was people like yourself raising the profile of the case and these issues. And then the other part, and we can never forget this. I do a lot of clemency work, and people will say, "Oh, well, that was great. You got this guy or this woman clemency." And I always correct them and say, "I didn't get them clemency. They got themselves clemency." And that if Myon Burrell is granted clemency on Tuesday of next week, none of us should take credit for it except for Myon Burrell, because the way that he has withstood everything, the way that he has matured, the way that he has taken responsibility for himself and his development and his adulthood and his family, that in the end, he is the one who has earned himself what he gets if he does get it.
Yes. And I believe that his faith has sustained him.
I do too.
Through this process, as well as some of the friends that he has met in prison. I know that was one of the things that really influenced me. I had a young man in the community who spent time inside the justice system, who is now working on the outside on behalf of community. He messaged me when I first posted about this case, and he said, "I know that Myon is innocent." And he talked about how so many other people inside of the prison system knew for a fact that Myon was innocent. I think that we lost Mark. He might have lost his connection. Hopefully he'll be able. Oh, there he is. Okay, great. So that was one of the things that influenced me, having someone I knew in the community say, Myon's innocent. Everyone knows it. So, take a look at this. And so I'm glad that you all did. I want to shift for a minute and talk about your clemency work, which you just referenced. You wrote an op-ed, a couple of them, more than a couple, but you wrote one in 2016 in the New York Times that talked about President Obama's clemency problem. So can you give some context regarding why you wrote that op-ed, what you were asking President Obama to do as the first biracial president of the United States, who in part ran on this platform of helping to address some of the disparities in the criminal justice system? What were you imploring him to do? And then what was the outcome of that process?
Yeah, well, we started imploring him a long time before that. When you and I were both working on the crack powder ratio, one of the things that happened is that I won a case in the Supreme Court, the Spears case, and that came down the day after President Obama was inaugurated. On that that day, and that's the day we started working on clemency, because we realized it was a way to get to these almost all black people in prison who were way over sentenced. It's all branches of government now set. And so with Nikichi Taifa in Washington, D.C., the two of us teamed up, and we went into the White House 5 times, I think, before 2016 and pushed them to do something, to grant clemency, to develop a program, to get to these people who no one thought should be in prison at that point. And in 2016, we reached a breaking point. He'd announced an initiative that was supposed to get to these people. It wasn't being productive. And so that New York Times piece actually came out the day after I'd been invited to a meeting at the White House. And I kind of gave a rant to Valerie Jarrett and a lot of other people about this. And I wasn't the only person giving a rant at that time. There's a lot of people who were, including you. And eventually, President Obama did release about 1,700 people. He commuted the sentences of about 1,700 people doing long terms, almost all for narcotics cases, and overwhelmingly people of color. And that was something. It was good. It was the first principled use of the clemency power that we'd seen in decades. And that was a great thing. Now, unfortunately, he didn't change the structure of how this consideration happens. And that's something that we're continuing to push for as we enter a new administration.
And didn't you get your law students involved as well with reviewing those petitions? I think you set up a clinic, right?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I came to St. Thomas. I mean, when I was interviewing with you for the job, I gotten tenure and everything down in Baylor. I wasn't really looking for a job, but I came up here to give a colloquium and gave my talk. And afterwards, they said, "Hey, you ever think about leaving Baylor?" And one of the things I said was, "Well, could I have a clinic to do clemency work?" And they said yes. And so that even though I'd never run a clinic before, we started one. And that's been one of the real incredible things that I've gotten to do, is to work with the students where we send them to the prisons. They have to go and spend two days with our client in a federal prison. They have to figure out how to get in there, how to have the meeting, how to set it up, how to deal with that bureaucracy, which is terrible. But it is transformative for the students. And leaving aside the successes that we've had, we've been able to get people out. But for the students, to understand what that means to walk into prison and meet someone and hear their story. And, with Rachel Barco too, we raised some money and we set up a pop-up law firm for a year during that Obama initiative. And between that and the clinic, we got over 100 people out. And that's, we're hoping those days will come again.
That's incredibly powerful. Your work makes a huge difference. I think that some of the people watching are probably wondering, as a white man who has some level of privilege and who was a former federal prosecutor, how did you get to the point where you're able to see some of these injustices, to have compassion, and actually to use your privilege or education? You're a law graduate from Yale. And most of the time we don't expect people who went to Yale, Harvard, Stanford, and even schools that are not at that level to actually roll up their sleeves and get involved in being a vessel for change. So what happened that caused you to shift from your role as a prosecutor to where you are today?
I can tell you the person's name. It's Andrew Densimo. He's a black federal defender in Detroit. We had a bunch of crack cases against one another where I was the prosecutor. And there was mandatory sentencing. So I never had to argue sentencing, but he always did. And I remember a judge once, Anna Diggs Taylor, saying to him, "Are you going to make your usual futile speech, Andrew?" when we had a sentencing. And he did. He went on for 25 minutes, and he knew it wasn't going to make a difference. And he talked about the way that it wasn't going to make anything in his community any better. It was going to make it worse. And that if you went to that place where this kid was caught selling crack, there's someone else doing it right now. Nobody's not getting crack because we're locking this kid up. And what's going to happen to that kid too? And I went back to my office, and I just kept hearing Andrew's voice and the others who made those arguments. And I couldn't do it anymore. And I saw it. I got it finally. And then I started to work on the other side with you and with the other people who led me to that work. I mean, I had to be led to it by people with principle like you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a part of this story too, is that when we won that case in the Supreme Court, federal district court judges loved it because it gave them more discretion. And
Yes.
so a judge back in Detroit called me up, and a guy named Art Tarnow, and he said, "Mark, what happened to you? I saw that was your case, Spears case, that said that we could reject the 100-to-1 ratio." And I told him about Andrew Densemo's futile speech. And he said, "Did you ever tell Andrew that?" And this is like 12, 13 years later. And I never had. Here I left my job, moved across the country, had just changed sides, and I never told the guy who convinced me to do that. And I think for the people who are listening now, if it ever feels like you're giving a futile speech, like what you're saying is just going into the ether, well, think about this. One of those futile speeches changed me. And because of my privilege, largely, I could go forward and make great change. Mm-hmm. And even at that, I didn't even have the courtesy to turn back and tell the black man who had led me there that he had until that judge called me. Mm-hmm. So futile speeches are powerful because you don't know who's listening, and you don't know whose heart or mind might be open that you assume is closed. And even when no one responds and no one affirms you in what you're saying, you still may be making the biggest difference you ever did. Mm-hmm. Because you don't know who's listening and who's being changed. We put a ripple in the pond and it goes out. We don't know what boats that pushes. Mm-hmm. And that's been a real motivator for me going forward too.
Mm-hmm. That's powerful. I wish I had a collection plate, because I feel like we just got from you, like speaking the truth and encouraging us to continue speaking truth to power, not knowing who we're going to impact. I mean, that's literally the way I think about it, because I don't know who's listening, who isn't, who cares, who doesn't. I just pray and I'm like, Lord, just help us get this message out and reach the people who need to be reached. Mm-hmm. And there's that, you being one person, look at the impact you've been able to make now that your eyes are more open and you're more willing to put yourself in the line of fire, if you will, because as you know, you have detractors, you have people who oppose a message of justice.
But one thing that people with privilege like me have to remember is that we can't go forward and act as if we have the lived experience of oppression. That when I do this work, I'm going to do it with, and often with, the leadership of someone like Nikita Taifa. And that is pretty important, that even as we move forward and have an open heart and an open mind and a changed conviction, that we be willing to listen at least as much as we talk.
Absolutely. And I love that you're bringing up Nekima Taifa. I remember that she came to St. Thomas Law School and spoke. I think you helped bring her there. Yeah. And she's the truth-telling Black woman. Like, that's the powerful part. Just reminding people to listen to what Black people are saying. We do have the lived experience. Most of the time, many of us also have the passion, to speak the truth and the resolve to be steadfast and persistent. And that's because of what our ancestors have been through. They didn't give up. So we don't have any choice but to persevere until we see massive change happening.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
as our time is wrapping up, I want to make sure to give you an opportunity to share any last words about Myon Burrell's case, or message to Myon or anyone who is paying attention to this case. And then also, what do you think is the main thing that needs to change as far as the system of mass incarceration is concerned?
Yeah, in terms of the system of mass incarceration, what we need to do is completely restructure the way we think about punishment. That when we allow a lot of discretion into the system, in a society that includes racism, then racism is going to inform the use of that discretion. And I talk a lot to conservative white groups and churches and things, and my first step is very often convincing them that there is systemic racism, that there is racism in the system. And here's how I do that, is I start by saying, will you accept that some people in our society are racist? And usually people are. They're not going to pretend that nobody in the society is, but some people are. And then I describe the amount of discretion that a prosecutor has in charging and seeking a sentence in so many areas, in crafting a plea. And then the conclusion is pretty obvious, that if there's racism in the society, then there's going to be racism in that employment of discretion, whether it's a police officer with his knee on the neck of someone, or it's a prosecutor in a suit in court who's making an argument. And we have to get to that. And it's a big project. But in terms of mass incarceration, we need everything at once. We need clemency. We need second chance. We need reform. We need bail reform. We need to change the way things are charged. And we need a complete revision of our narcotics laws so that we're not locking people up without making any difference or making anyone's life any better.
Maybe if we started locking up the heads of pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
Narcotics laws will change.
Yeah, the thing about that is, like, the excuse for locking up low-level drug dealers a lot is that it's deterrence, right? We're going to deter other people. But if you're going to believe in deterrence, you have to believe that people are trained at cost-benefit evaluation. You know who's trained at cost-benefit evaluation? The head of the pharmaceutical company. And so if we're going to have mandatory minimums and things like that, it should be on white-collar crimes, not narcotics crimes.
Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Right.
Any last words regarding Myon Burrell and his case?
Yeah, and it's just that this is a man whose fate's going to be decided next week. And you're absolutely right that our prayers, our thoughts have to go towards him and in support of him, regardless of what happens. And the other thing is that we have to hope that his case is a key that unlocks a much broader discussion of what's right and what's wrong in criminal justice.
Absolutely. That was powerful. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking the time to speak with me, for all the work that you did in chairing that legal panel, and all of your colleagues who were a part of that process. We are grateful for you all as folks who live in the Twin Cities and who want to see justice for Myon. And I'm glad that Myon knows about your work, that he supports your work, and he's thankful that you all looked at this case with, as he calls it, fresh, unbiased eyes. And now that we've all done our parts up to this point, we place it in God's hands and we see what happens. Yep. And then we go from there after Tuesday.
Absolutely. And thank you for being one of the people that led me to the place where I'm able to do this work in the first place.
Absolutely. My honor and privilege.
All right.